Welcome back to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and in today's episode, I'm going to be looking at something I've talked a lot about here on the podcast, which is the revolutionary radicalism of American youth on college campuses through social media and the support of Gen Z for not just the idea of Palestinian nation statehood and self-determination, but for Hamas and their use of violence as quote unquote armed resistance. The recent detainment and potential deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, I think perfectly highlights that debate here in the West and the ideological war we are currently fighting. So I want to look at what the Free Palestine movement is and what it is calling for and what it fails to call for. What the Free Palestine movement here in the West, and I'm talking specifically about the social justice movement here in the West and what Palestine means to social justice activism, is calling for the dismantling of Israel, but also for the dismantling of the West. And that is why we see the current presidential administration cracking down on college protesters, specifically those who hold student visas or green cards. Khalil is a perfect example of that. The call to dismantle the West is an ideological war, and it's one we need to take extremely seriously because we see the fight for that in Europe happening right now with the spread of Islam and the fight to maintain Western democratic values in places such as the United Kingdom. This is a legitimate concern which the current administration is tackling. But the Marxist social justice left here in the West has co-opted the idea of Palestine and made it and elevated it to a moral symbol. It symbolizes the oppressed class in the oppressor-oppressed paradigm through which neo-Marxism views the world, views governments, economics, and social justice. The oppressor versus oppressed narrative elevates Palestine to this moral symbol, the idea being that once Palestine is free, then every other oppressed or disenfranchised identity in the West will also be liberated through the liberation of Palestine. And this narrative has been carefully crafted and propagated through revising actual historic events, because in order for Israel to be viewed as the oppressor, has been named as the colonizing power, even though Israel is one of the most successful examples of post-World War II decolonization. The idea of nationalism swept Europe prior to World War I. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire fell, which included what on the map was named Palestine, the Palestinian territories. And after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, France and Britain moved in, and then they carved up the map into different basically nation state proposals, one for the Jewish people, one for Palestinian Arabs. Israel was established in 1948, and Palestinian national groups have rejected every proposal for a Palestinian state since. And that leads us to today with the PA in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, calling for the right to self-determine, but also failing to hold into accountability the Palestinian leaders who have hindered that process or rejected any sort of peace proposal moving forward. So again, this social justice narrative of what Palestine is has been largely romanticized here in the West and on university campuses, and it is this symbol. Once Palestine is free, then every other intersectional identity and oppressed identity here in the West will also be free. And again, this is based on revisionist history. It's not dealing with reality. If you look at social justice activism across American university campuses, they talk about colonialism as if it is a modern reality and not a historical fact. What the Free Palestine social justice movement here in the West fails to do, so what they do is they call for the dismantling of Israel in the West. What they fail to do is propose any sort of viable policy prescription to help achieve Palestinian nation statehood. The movement has not really evolved from its talking points. Its talking points have always been that Israel is the colonizing, occupying power. They ethnically cleanse the region of Arab Palestinians, and the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, which they claim is a genocide, is just another example of the IDF's campaign against Arab Palestinians and their genocidal ambitions. So their talking points have not largely evolved. I would say that the rhetoric on American universities has become more radical, and that's more widely accepted and amplified. I went to Florida State University. I was a freshman in 2016, and there was a ton of pro-Palestinian activism happening on FSU's campus, and calls from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, were common. But I think the rejection of a two-state solution is now extremely prevalent on both sides of the political aisle and of the conflict. But the irony is when a Zionist says the two-state solution is no longer viable, that's radical. But when these college students call for the dismantling of Israel from the river to the sea, which is a rejection of the two-state solution, that's not radical. That is a freedom call. And that is legitimate Palestinian resistance. And so we see a rejection of the two-state solution, which has been the status quo. Again, I think both sides of the aisle would say that that's not viable moving forward. But the pro-Hamas college encampments are calling for the eradication of Israel, which is extremely radical. So there's no viable policy prescription. They're not interested in the reality on the ground. And again, they're not interested in holding Hamas accountable for ruining the chance for Palestinian self-determination in the Gaza Strip, which was the hope when Israel withdrew in 2005. And that leads me to my next point, which is in projecting your own plight on the Palestinian desire for self-determination, we see the development of main character syndrome and narcissism here in the West, which is kind of reading your own struggle, your own victimhood narrative into a conflict across the world, across an ocean in the Middle East, from which you actually have no relationship to. And we saw this a ton with, Queers for Palestine. That's an ideological contradiction. You cannot say Queers for Palestine because if you were to go to Palestine as a homosexual or as a queer, you would soon find out that Hamas, which is a radical Islamist regime, an authoritarian regime, does not provide any protections for homosexuality, and it is against Sharia law. So there really is no connection for a queer Westerner to feel that they need to support Palestinians in Gaza, except for the fact that they read their own victimhood narrative and their own plight or their own struggle onto the struggle of Palestinians, and therefore their fight is won. And I'm going to show you a video in a second of a transgender activist kind of explaining that much. But I've identified 3 archetypes of college encampment protesters or social justice leftists who are part of this Free Palestine movement. One common archetype you'll see will be white Americans, young Americans, Gen Zers who reject their Western identity, who reject the privilege of being born in the United States. They are divesting whites. And the social justice movement, which is very much a religion of sorts, it's a postmodern religion. It's void of truth, capital T. It's, a constructed truth. It has proposed the idea that if you are a white and you're inherently racist, you can provide penance for that, because by virtue of being white, you are automatically of the oppressor class. You can provide penance and receive salvation through aligning yourself with and being an ally for minorities and disenfranchised groups. So we see many divesting whites. Bushel, who was the young man who set himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy in 2024, is a great example of that. Someone who went to extreme lengths to demonstrate their divestment from being a member of the United States and standing in solidarity with Palestinians. Another common archetype you'll see at these encampment protests or part of the social justice movement are other minorities or other people who identify as part of the oppressed class. I have a graph here that kind of helps demonstrate that. They'll oftentimes in the social justice movement here in the West talk about intersectional justice, which again is that idea that once Palestine is free, then intersectional justice for these other demographics will also be provided. So you have racial identity, gender, nationality, disability, sexuality. If you're a member of any of these or multiple of these disenfranchised or oppressed classes, then you are part of the social justice movement by virtue of your identity, and you can then band with other disenfranchised identities to help liberate society from the oppressor class. And then the third archetype are foreign students, and that's where Mahmoud Khalil comes in. He, of course, is of Palestinian descent. We see many Arab students on American university campuses protesting the West and protesting Israel. Again, Israel is really synonymous with the West when they call for the dismantling of Israel. And Khalil is a perfect example of that. So you have these foreign students who have the privilege of studying in the United States, maybe at some of the most prestigious universities such as Columbia, and they exercise freedom of assembly and freedom of speech to call for the dismantling of the West, which is not even their home, So as a stranger and as a foreigner, they're coming into the United States and calling for the dismantling of the United States and exercising the democratic rights only provided to them in the United States to stand in solidarity with an authoritarian Islamist regime in the Middle East. It's an ideological contradiction. So those are our three archetypes. And I thought I would show you some examples of that. So environmental climate justice is also another social justice issue that has aligned itself with the Palestinian movement. On the screen is a infographic from Instagram. It says environmentalist for a free Palestine. Greta Thunberg was also a huge pro-Palestine activist. This is a video of trans activists talking about how their experience in the West and the genocide of transgenders in the West aligns them with the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. Okay, so basically that social media influencer was saying the United States was built on genocide, Israel is perpetrating a genocide, their lived experience as a transgender individual in the United States is one of surviving a genocide, so therefore their fight against oppression is the exact same as a Palestinians' fight against oppression in Gaza. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a lot of projecting, and it's a lot of, again, aligning victimhood narratives, because again, it's also not rooted in reality. There isn't a genocide of transgenders here in the United States. But again, it's reading in their own plight into someone else's plight, which again is that main character syndrome. It's extremely narcissistic. And then another kind of social justice issue, which has aligned itself with the Free Palestine movement, is one that swept the United States in 2020, BLM, following the death of George Floyd. And I think one of the biggest watershed moments for social justice activism here in the West. We saw the proliferation of critical theory and academic language brought to the mainstream. It became prevalent on social media and Instagram. And I think that's when millennials and Gen Zers became extremely indoctrinated and comfortable with the language that was once really relegated to university classrooms and high academia. And this is when I think neo-Marxism as like a framework and a worldview moved mainstream. And we've seen the alliance between BLM and the Palestinian movement for years and years and years. This is not new either. This goes back even to the 60s. This is on the screen. This is George Floyd on a mural on one of the security walls dividing Israel and the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria. And here was an infographic I found on Instagram kind of highlighting what they view as the relationship between Black America and Palestinian liberation. Here's a quote from the first slide of it. It says, "For decades, journalists, academics, and organizers have put the Black and Palestinian liberation struggles in conversation with one another, but now is an especially crucial time to move beyond passive conversations and solidarity in the abstract." And the infographic basically makes the case that the fight for Black America to throw off their colonizers is the same as Palestinians to throw off their Israeli colonizers. And so we see some of these through lines with these different social justice movements. Again, I would argue there's quite a bit of main character syndrome or narcissism in being an American who identifies as a victim, and therefore that mutual victimhood identity aligns you with the Palestinian cause, even though you have really no idea about the conflict, the history of the conflict, and you're unwilling to condemn the perpetrators of violence, which is Hamas, not just against Israelis, but against Palestinians as well. So to review, the Free Palestine social justice movement is not about Palestinian statehood. It is about tearing down Israel and the West and the liberation of the oppressed from their oppressors. There's a few individuals who I think really highlight this. We already talked about Mahmoud Khalil in the last episode. I did talk about Aaron Bushnell. He was one of the young men in 2024 who lit himself on fire in protest of the war in Gaza. He was a U.S. military member, and he kind of became the symbol of Marxist revolution against not just Israel, but of the United States. That's obviously an extreme example. And I think only a deeply troubled person would do that. But we do see an entire generation of young people who I believe are well-meaning, most of them, many of them, not all of them, and who do have a heart for people in need or disenfranchised people or for injustice, but they have been indoctrinated in how to view what injustice is and to hold the wrong actors accountable for that injustice. And so I do believe many of these young people are altruistic and they have the right intentions, but they have been propagated and indoctrinated to view the wrong perpetrators as those of Israel instead of looking to Hamas as the actors who need to be held accountable for the plight of Palestinians. We also have Rachel Corrie. The 22-year anniversary of her death was this week, which is why I also wanted to highlight her. Rachel Corrie was a young American who was born in Olympia, Washington, which is an extremely liberal part of the United States. And she was a young activist. She was a young activist from an early age, I think as early as 10 from what I've researched. This was an infographic that was going around this week. You see 70,000 likes. So her story is a very well-known story within the Free Palestine social justice movement. She has become a martyr for the movement, but she was a young American who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer in a town near Rafah as she was protesting the demolition of a house there. And her story has been largely propagated, and depending on what side of the conflict you sit on, you're going to view the facts surrounding her story differently. But the claim is that the IDF killed her for protesting, and it was retribution for protecting or calling for the protection of Palestinians. And in reality, she was a young American who came to the Middle East, was working in and around Rafah, and put herself in the middle of a conflict zone and threw her body on the rubble of a house that was actually operating as a militant outpost. It was used to fire at IDF soldiers. And the reason the home was being demolished was because terror tunnels were being built under these homes. And now we know, of course, after the war started, that Hamas's complex terror tunnels are larger than the New York City metro system. And so she would have been in Gaza around the time that those were being dug. And she threw herself on the house of an Islamist family or a family sympathetic to the Islamist agenda. And it wasn't as simple as the media portrayed. And her death, of course, is a tragedy. It was absolutely senseless, but it was not because the IDF wanted to make an example of her and kill her. It was because she was protecting a house being used for terror tunnels, which again, we see today that there is a very complex network of terror tunnels under the Gaza Strip. She died, unfortunately, like I said, protesting the house demolition, and she was run over by the bulldozer. The IDF claimed that they did not see her because she was hidden. And of course, the pro-Palestine side claims that she was intentionally killed. But the reason I bring her up as well is because this is another white, young American social justice activist who threw herself in the middle of a conflict zone. And then her death was not her own responsibility for putting herself in that situation, but it was because of some evil intention of Israel to squash her righteous fight against evil and oppression. And that narrative, which again has been propagated and has become urban legend for the Free Palestine movement, is extremely dangerous because we see young people risking their lives to protect or be complicit in the actions of an Islamist organization. And then there's no accountability for that or recognition of that. And again, her life lost is, in my opinion, a life in vain. Aaron's life, setting himself on fire, was a life lost in vain for a cause, whether or not they believe truly was a righteous cause or because they fell for the propaganda of it. It is horrific, but I think it highlights the extreme ends to which some of these young people are indoctrinated and what they're willing to do. And this brings us, I think, to the reality that there's a cycle of victimhood and a victimhood narrative. And it breaks my heart for the youth of America that victimhood status is something that people identify with. And we see this across American universities. But that cycle of victimhood, I think, is also one that has kept the Palestinians in the Palestinian territories stateless for decades and decades and decades. And Hussein Mansour, who I've had here on the podcast, has an amazing Substack, which I will link in the description box down below. But he wrote this, speaking about the crumbling legitimacy of Palestine. But I think it's important to read because it also highlights why the neo-Marxist left here in the West, I think, identifies so heavily with the Palestinian plight. He writes, the concept of a sovereign Palestinian state was, at its inception, interwoven with big ideas, anti-imperial liberation, which again, I've touched on this whole video. That's kind of where the neo-Marxist social justice left here in the West comes in to align themselves with Palestine. The romance of revolution, which again, I think is something that young people here in the West are fantasizing about. I think American Westerners are so removed from actual conflict that they find meaning in their lives protesting conflicts abroad or manufactured hardships here in the United States because it provides some sort of meaning, and it's definitely romanticized on American university campuses. He continues global anti-capitalism, which again, the fight for Palestine has also come to symbolize that, and the quest for national self-determination. But subsequent decades have shown that the Palestinians never grasped the viable political path. Instead, an identity was cultivated of an endless cycle of grievance, victimhood, and, all too often, terror as a method of expression, celebrated and valorized by the most depraved elite Western intellectuals, which we see on our American university campuses, which then has led to these college encampment protests, including their Arab Jewish radical acolytes sitting at the summit of Western culture and education. By now, it should be clear to all that when your primary currency is kidnapping civilians and parading the remains to public cheers, you forfeit whatever moral capital a national struggle might once have enjoyed. And that last line I think is so important because I also think that those here in the West who support Hamas as legitimate armed resistance forfeit any moral ground. But it's because the postmodern West here, especially on elite campuses, have rewritten what truth and morality is, that they have that standing. And it is that cycle of victimhood that aligns different identified minorities here in the West with the Palestinian plight. And so all of this to say, what we're seeing on American campuses is extremely dangerous. It is the call to dismantle the West and the very values that these young Americans who freely assemble and freely protest enjoy. And they don't understand that their protest against America undermines that very right. And we have a whole generation who are our future leaders and who will vote in our future leaders who disdain the West, reject the privilege of being an American, which again is not perfect, but is definitely a privilege. And they view Hamas as a legitimate actor. And in doing so, they endorse their authoritarian tactics and their jihadist mindset, which is an incredible national security threat. Which brings me back to my opening, which was Mahmoud Khalil and what the current presidential administration is doing. What they're doing is they are identifying a really dangerous trend, which undermines our national security. And unfortunately, they can't do much about those young students who are born here in the United States. And so it's important to disseminate proper information, to crack down on radicalism on university campuses, to delegitimize the use of attrition or intimidation on the part of students to other faculty or to other peers, and to hold those who are inciting this radicalism accountable. I am sure that Mahmoud Khalil is not going to be the first individual which this administration makes an example of, and we will continue to follow this story and any additional actors who are held accountable for the attrition inflicted on American university campuses, including Columbia, over the last 17 months. That was a lot. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Like always, please like, comment, and subscribe, and please follow us on all of our social media channels. We do provide a lot of educational materials on the historic, academic, and philosophical roots of the dangerous social justice movement sweeping America today. I will see you in the next episode. Have a good one.